A millionaire weeps before his wife's grave. Suddenly, a young beggar girl appears and says, "She's alive." Overcome by desperation and hope, he follows the child, but what he discovers will shock everyone. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. The morning arrived silently at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, as if even the city's noise knew to respect this place, where time seemed suspended between the past and eternity. Richard Miller parked his car at the entrance, turned off the engine, and just sat there, staring through the windshield, hazed by the fine drizzle falling over the city. It had been 6 months. 6 months since Helen had left, taking with her all the light that illuminated his life. 6 months of a pain that didn't lessen, that didn't become familiar, that insisted on tearing his chest apart every morning when he woke up and realized she was no longer there. He opened the car door slowly, as if a sudden movement could break something invisible that still held him together. The cold morning air touched his face, mixing with the tears he could no longer hold back. Richard was a 42-year-old man, successful in business, respected among his peers, but none of that mattered when he was here, before the white marble headstone that held the name of the woman he had loved for 15 years. Helen Miller, born in 1983. He couldn't read the final date without the world spinning around him. It was too soon, too unfair. She was only 41 when a sudden complication took her, swift and cruel like a lightning bolt on a sunny day. Richard still remembered every detail of that terrible day, but he preferred not to think about it. He preferred to come here and talk to her, as if Helen could hear him through the cold stone, through the silence that separated the living from those who had departed. He knelt before the headstone and placed the flowers he had brought. White roses, always white roses, Helen's favorite. The soft scent of the petals mixed with the aroma of wet earth and fallen leaves. Richard ran his hand over the smooth surface of the marble, feeling the cold seep into his fingers, and began to speak. "Hi, my love, I'm here again. I know you must be tired of hearing from me, but I can't stay away. I can't accept that you left like this so fast, without giving me time to prepare. How am I supposed to prepare to lose you, Helen? How?" His voice came out choked, trembling, laden with a pain that found no solace. Around him the cemetery was practically empty. Just a few distant people, also lost in their own silent conversations with those who were no longer there. Richard continued speaking, the words tumbling out as if he were really talking to her, just as they did. Every night before sleep, when they still shared the same bed, the same dreams, the same life. "I would give anything, Helen. Are you listening to me? Everything I have. All my fortune, my company, my house, everything. I would give it all just to see you one more time. Just to hold you, to smell your perfume, to hear your laugh. I don't know how to live without you. I don't know." It was at that moment, at the height of his despair, his face wet with tears and rain, that Richard felt a presence beside him. He turned, his head slowly, and saw a girl. She must have been about 10, maybe 11 years old. She was dirty, with torn clothes far too big for her thin body, her tangled hair falling over a small face marked by life on the streets. She watched him with dark, deep eyes, an expression strangely serious for a child. "She's not dead," the girl said, her voice firm, clear, without hesitation. Richard blinked, confused, still immersed in his own pain. For a moment, he thought he had misheard, that the rain or the wind had distorted the words, but the girl remained there still, looking directly at him with a certainty that seemed mismatched with her frail and vulnerable appearance. "What?" Richard managed to say, his voice hoarse. "The woman you're crying for. She's not dead. I've seen her. She's alive." Richard's first reaction was anger, a sudden, violent anger that rose from the pit of his stomach like lava from a volcano. How dare this girl play with his pain? How did she have the nerve to come here, at this sacred moment, and say something so absurd, so cruel? He stood up abruptly, his fists clenched, his whole body shaking. "Get out of here, get out now, you have no right to say that, you don't know anything." But the girl didn't move. She showed no fear. She just kept looking at him with that same serene expression, as if expecting exactly that reaction. Richard took a step forward, but something stopped him. Maybe it was her gaze. Maybe it was the way she spoke, without malice, without ulterior motives. There was something genuine there, something that made him hesitate. "I saw her," the girl repeated, now in a softer, almost understanding tone. "She sells hot dogs at the Port Authority bus terminal. I go there every week and she's always there. She looks just like the picture on the gravestone, exactly like it." Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Port Authority. Hot dogs. It made no sense. Helen was here, buried. He had seen her body placed in that casket. He had followed the entire process, had cried until he had no tears left. How could there be someone selling hot dogs at the terminal? And even if there was, why would this girl come to him with this story? "You're lying," Richard said, but his voice no longer had the same force. There was doubt now, a small but persistent doubt that was beginning to grow in his mind. "I don't lie," the girl replied, crossing her thin arms over her chest. "But if you want to know the truth, get me some food. I'm really hungry." Richard looked at her more closely. He noticed the prominent bones under her skin, the deep dark circles under her eyes, the accumulated dirt on her hands and bare feet. This child was clearly homeless, surviving as best she could on the streets of a giant, indifferent city. Something inside him stirred despite the anger, despite the confusion. Helen always had a huge heart for children. She had always wanted to adopt, but they were never able to. "All right," Richard said, still suspicious. "I'll get you food, but you're going to explain to me exactly what you're talking about." They left the cemetery together, a strange sight. A well-dressed man in a dark suit and polished shoes, walking beside a homeless girl, barefoot and dirty. Richard took her to a nearby diner, a classic New York establishment with display cases full of pastries, cakes and sandwiches. The girl followed him inside, her eyes wide at the sight of so much food. "You can order whatever you want," Richard said, sitting at a table in the back. The girl didn't wait to be asked twice. She ordered a full meal, juice, bread, cake, everything her eyes could see. The waiter looked on with suspicion, but Richard nodded, authorizing it. When the food arrived, the girl began to eat with a voraciousness that was heartbreaking. Richard realized she hadn't eaten in days, maybe weeks. Each forkful was a battle won against the hunger that consumed her. As she ate, Richard watched in silence. His mind was in turmoil, trying to process what had happened. A part of him wanted to believe this was just the delusion of a street kid, an attempt to get food or money. But there was something in the girl's certainty, something in the way she spoke that prevented him from simply dismissing her words. When she finally finished eating, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at Richard. "My name is Julia," she said. "I don't have a family. I've lived on the street since I was very little. My mom left me in a park and never came back." "I'm sorry," Richard said, and he meant it. "Don't be," Julia replied, shrugging. "I'm used to it. The street teaches you how to get by. But about the woman, it's true, I swear. She's at the terminal, in the area for the interstate buses. She has a little hot dog cart. She looks exactly like the photo on the gravestone. I know because I looked closely when you were crying." Richard was silent for a long moment. His heart was pounding. Logic told him it was impossible. But what if it wasn't? What if there was some explanation? A sister he didn't know about, a cousin? Helen never talked much about her birth family. She had been adopted as a baby by a traditional New York family, the Andersons, and had grown up with all the comfort and education money could buy. But what about before that? What if there was someone she never knew? "Take me there," Richard said, finally making a decision. "Show me this woman." Julia nodded and stood up. Richard paid the bill and the two left the diner. He offered her a ride in his car, but Julia hesitated before accepting, clearly unaccustomed to gestures of kindness. Once inside the vehicle, she remained quiet, looking out the window as Richard drove toward the Port Authority terminal. The drive took about 20 minutes in the heavy New York traffic. Richard felt his stomach churn, a mixture of hope and fear consuming him from within. What would he do if he really found someone who looked like Helen? How would he react? And what if it was no one? What if it was just a superficial resemblance that a child's eyes had mistaken for identity? When they arrived at the terminal, Julia got out of the car quickly and began to walk through the crowd. Richard followed her, his eyes trying to keep up with her amidst so many people. The Port Authority bus terminal was one of the largest in the world, a human anthill where thousands of people circulated every day, coming and going from all over the country. The smell of street food mixed with diesel and sweat. Julia knew this place well, that much was evident. She moved with ease, dodging people, avoiding security guards, following a path only she seemed to know. Finally, she stopped in front of a simple cart, painted red and yellow with a handwritten sign, Maria's Hot Dogs. Behind the counter, a woman of about 40 was grilling hot dogs on a large flat-top grill. She wore a stained apron, her hair tied back in a ponytail, and there was sweat on her brow from the heat of the grill. When she turned her face to serve a customer, Richard felt the world stop. It was Helen, or at least it looked like her. The same almond-shaped brown eyes, the same delicate nose, the same curve of the lips. The features were identical, frighteningly identical, but there were differences too. This woman's skin was more weathered by the sun. There were lines of exhaustion around her eyes, a harder expression shaped by a life of hard work. Her hands were calloused, her shoulders slightly stooped. It wasn't Helen, but it was absurdly similar. Richard was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. Julia tugged on his sleeve. "I told you," she said in a low voice. "That's her." The woman finished serving the customer and looked up. For a brief second, her gaze met Richard's. She frowned, confused, perhaps bothered by the way he was staring at her. Richard took a step forward, then another, until he was standing in front of the cart's counter. "Excuse me," he managed to say, his voice failing. "Can I speak with you for a minute?" The woman looked at him suspiciously. "If you're here to buy a hot dog, you can order. If not, I'm busy." "Please," Richard insisted. "It's important. It's about your family." She seemed to hesitate. The word family clearly touched something in her because her expression changed slightly. It was no longer just suspicion, but also curiosity, perhaps a touch of vulnerability. "I don't have a family," she said in a low voice. "Never have." "Please," Richard repeated. "Just a few minutes. I need to show you something." The woman looked around. There weren't many customers at that moment. She sighed and nodded. "All right. But be quick." Richard took his phone out of his pocket with trembling hands. He opened the photo gallery and showed her an image of Helen taken just a few months before she passed. In the photo, Helen was smiling, her hair loose in the wind, on a day out in the park. The woman took the phone, looked at the photo, and grew pale. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice now trembling as well. "She was my wife," Richard said. "Her name was Helen, and she passed away 6 months ago." The woman continued to stare at the photo as if she were seeing a ghost. Her fingers tightened on the phone. "She looks just like me," she whispered. "I know," Richard said. "That's why I'm here. I need to understand what's happening." The woman handed back the phone and looked at Richard with eyes full of tears she was trying to hold back. "My name is Maria," she said. "Maria Smith. I never knew who my parents were. I grew up in an orphanage, went through several foster homes, until I turned 18 and was on my own. I never had a real last name. Smith was what they gave me at the orphanage. I always thought I was all alone in the world, that I had no one." Richard felt tears stream down his own face. He didn't know what to say, how to process this information. Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "Do you think she was my sister?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Richard admitted, "but I'm going to find out. Can you give me a few minutes of your time? Can we sit and talk?" Maria hesitated, but something inside her gave way. She called over an acquaintance who worked at a nearby cart and asked her to watch her hot dogs for a few minutes. Then, she and Richard sat on a nearby bench with Julia beside them, observing everything in silence. There, in that noisy terminal, surrounded by thousands of strangers, Richard began to tell Helen's story. He spoke of how he had met her at a business conference, how they had fallen in love instantly, how they had built a life together. He spoke of the love they shared, the plans they made, the dreams they had, and he spoke of how it all came crashing down when she left, leaving a void impossible to fill. Maria listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the ground, her breathing uneven. When Richard finished, she finally spoke. She had a good life then. She had love, she had comfort, she had everything I never had. There was no bitterness in her voice, only acknowledgement. A deep sadness, but also resignation. Richard looked at her and felt an immense compassion grow in his chest. "I'm going to find out the truth," he promised. "If you are sisters, you deserve to know. You deserve to have answers." Maria raised her eyes and met his. For a moment, their gazes connected, and Richard saw something there that moved him deeply. It wasn't just the physical resemblance to Helen. It was the strength, the resilience, the courage of someone who had survived a lifetime of abandonment and loneliness, and yet was still standing, fighting, working, trying to build something with her own hands. "Why are you doing this?" Maria asked. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." Richard thought for a moment before answering. "Because Helen would have done the same thing, and because, if there's a chance, however small, that you are her sister, then I need to know, for her, and for you." Maria nodded slowly. She gave Richard her phone number, a number for an old scratched cell phone she pulled from her apron pocket. They agreed to meet again as soon as Richard had some information. When she returned to her hot dog cart, Richard stood there, watching her work. Julia tugged on his sleeve again. "What about me?" she asked. "I helped you. Are you going to help me too?" Richard looked down at the girl and smiled for the first time in 6 months. "Yes, Julia. I'm going to help you. I promise." As he drove back home, Richard's mind was in a whirlwind. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to look for them. As soon as he arrived at his luxurious apartment on the Upper West Side, he picked up the phone and called a private investigator who had previously worked for his company on corporate matters. The man answered on the third ring. "Richard, it's been a while. What can I do for you?" "I need you to investigate something urgent," Richard said. "I need information about my wife's origins, everything you can find about her biological family before the adoption." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Richard, I'm very sorry for your loss, but this could be delicate, are you sure?" "Absolutely," Richard replied. "I need this information as soon as possible. Money is no object." "All right, I'll start today. I'll call you as soon as I have something." Richard hung up and walked to the window, looking out at the city that stretched before him. Out there, millions of lives were following their courses, each with its own stories, its own pains, its own quests. And somewhere in that urban vastness, there was a woman who might hold the key to understanding a mystery that would change everything. He touched the cold glass of the window and whispered to himself, "Helen, what didn't you tell me?" 3 days passed in a silent agony. Richard could barely sleep, barely eat. Each hour seemed to drag on like an eternity as he awaited the investigator's call. During that time, he visited Julia twice, bringing her food, clothes, and a new backpack. The girl accepted everything with a restrained gratitude, as if she weren't used to receiving without having to give something in return. Richard promised he would take care of her, that he would find a safe place for her to live, to study, to have a decent life. Julia listened to it all with that same serious, deep gaze, as if she had already learned not to fully trust the promises of adults. As for Maria, Richard couldn't get her image out of his head. Those eyes that were so much like Helen's, yet carried a completely different story. He found himself thinking about what her life must have been like, how many hardships she had faced, how many times she had been rejected or ignored. Guilt began to grow inside him, an irrational but persistent guilt, as if he were somehow responsible for all the suffering Maria had endured, while Helen grew up in comfort and security. On the morning of the 4th day, the phone finally rang. Richard answered before the second ring. "I found something," the investigator said, his voice carrying a sobriety that made Richard's stomach churn. "You need to come to my office. This isn't a conversation for the phone." Richard wasted no time. He took a quick shower, got dressed, and drove to the investigator's office, located in a discreet building in Midtown Manhattan. The man received him in a small but organized room with files stacked on shelves and an old computer on the desk. He pointed to a chair and Richard sat, his heart pounding. "First, I need to say this wasn't easy," the investigator began, adjusting his glasses. "Adoption records from decades ago are complicated. Many have been lost or poorly filed. But I have contacts and I managed to access some documents that confirm what you suspected." He pushed a manila folder across the desk. Richard opened it with trembling hands and began to read. They were copies of official documents, certificates, social worker reports, old and yellowed photographs. Each page was like a piece of a puzzle that was finally starting to make sense. Helen Anderson, born Helen Smith, was an identical twin, the investigator said, pointing to a birth certificate. Born in 1983 in a public hospital in New York, daughter of a woman named Rose Smith, then only 19 years old. Rose was extremely poor, with no family, no resources. She gave birth to 2 twin girls in precarious conditions. According to the reports, she tried to raise them both for a few months but couldn't manage. She had no money, no home, no support. Richard felt tears forming as he read. The story was even more tragic than he had imagined. Rose gave one of the babies up for adoption when they were about 4 months old, the investigator continued. That baby was quickly adopted by the Anderson family, who had money and influence. They gave her the name Helen and registered her as their legitimate daughter. The other baby, Maria, stayed with her mother for a few more months. But the situation only worsened. Rose tried to survive, but it was impossible. When Maria was about a year old, Rose left her at an orphanage, with a note asking them to take care of her, promising to return, but she never came back. "What happened to Rose?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible. The investigator lowered his eyes. "She passed away a few years later. She was living on the streets, in terrible conditions. There was no one to claim the body, so she was buried in a pauper's grave. Maria grew up in the foster care system, moving from institution to institution, never knowing she had a sister, never knowing her mother had desperately tried to keep her." Richard closed the folder and covered his face with his hands. The pain was overwhelming. Helen never knew. She never knew she had a twin sister, that somewhere in New York City there was someone who carried the same blood, the same face, but a completely opposite life. The Andersons never told her about her true origin. They raised her as if she were their biological daughter, hiding the past, perhaps protecting her, but also depriving her of knowing the truth. "There's more," the investigator said, hesitating. "I found records that Rose tried to locate Maria years later, when she had achieved some stability. She went to several orphanages, filled out forms, but never succeeded. Maria had already been transferred multiple times. The records were a mess, and Rose didn't have the resources to hire help. She searched until she couldn't anymore, until life on the streets consumed her completely." Richard stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city continued its frantic pace, indifferent to the personal tragedies unfolding in every corner, in every untold story. He thought of Maria, of everything she had lost without ever knowing what she could have had. He thought of Helen, who had lived an entire life without knowing, of her other half's existence. And he thought of Rose, a mother who had fought until the end, who never gave up, but who was defeated by the cruelty of a system that abandons the most vulnerable. "I have to tell Maria," Richard said, turning around. "She deserves to know the truth." "Are you sure?" the investigator asked. "This could be very painful for her." "It's already painful," Richard replied. "But at least now she'll have answers. She'll have the truth." Richard left the office with the folder of documents under his arm. He drove straight to the Port Authority terminal, his heart heavy but determined. When he reached the hot dog cart, Maria was there, as always, working under the midday heat. She saw him approach, and her face showed surprise. "You came back," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I need to talk to you," Richard said. "In private. It's important." Maria hesitated, but there was something in the tone of his voice, in the expression on his face, that made her agree. She asked a neighboring vendor to cover for her for a few minutes, and followed Richard to a quieter diner inside the terminal. They sat at a table in the back, away from the hustle and bustle. Richard placed the folder on the table and took a deep breath before he began. "Maria, I found out the truth about you and Helen, and it's a hard truth to hear." He opened the folder and began to show her the documents one by one, explaining every detail. Maria listened in silence, her eyes scanning the pages, seeing for the first time concrete proof of her own existence, her origin, a story that had always been a painful mystery. When Richard finished, Maria was crying, silently, tears streaming down her face without her making any effort to stop them. "I had a sister," she whispered, "a twin sister, and I never knew. She had everything, and I had nothing. And now she's gone, and I never even got to meet her." Richard reached out and touched her hand on the table. "I know this is unfair. I know nothing I say will change the past or lessen the pain. But you're not alone anymore, Maria. You have a history now. You know where you came from. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help." "You?" Maria looked up, confused. "Why would you do that? You don't owe me anything." "I owe it to Helen," Richard replied, "and I owe it to you. Because you were sisters, and because no one should have to face life alone the way you have." Maria pulled her hand back and wiped her tears with the back of her wrist. She looked at the documents spread across the table, at those names and dates that finally gave meaning to decades of unanswered questions. "My mother tried to find me," she said, her voice breaking. "She didn't really abandon me." "She tried. She tried," Richard confirmed, "until the very end." They sat in silence for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Maria spoke again. "What do you want to do now?" "I want to help you," Richard said. "I want you to have a better, more dignified life. You don't have to work at that cart under the sun every day if you don't want to. I can help you start a better business, help you pay off debts, provide support, with no strings attached, just because it's the right thing to do." Maria looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and hope. "People don't do things like that for free." "Helen would have," Richard said simply, "and so will I." In the days that followed, Richard began to put his plan into action. First, he paid off the debts Maria had accumulated with suppliers and for the rent of her cart space. Then he renovated the structure, bought new equipment, and hired someone to help her during peak hours. Maria resisted at first, too proud to accept charity, but Richard was patient and insistent. He explained that it wasn't charity, it was justice, was a way to correct, however minimally, the injustices that fate had imposed on her. Meanwhile, he also fulfilled his promise to Julia. He found a special group home, run by a reputable non-profit, where the girl could live, study, and receive the care she deserved. Julia accepted with that same seriousness that characterized her, but Richard noticed a different sparkle in her eyes when she saw the room that would be hers, the clean bed, the new clothes, the books on the shelves. For the first time she smiled. It was a small, shy but genuine smile. As the weeks passed, Richard began to visit Maria more frequently. At first, they were practical visits to resolve business issues, to ensure everything was running smoothly. But gradually, the conversations became more personal. Maria began to open up, to talk about her childhood in orphanages, about the temporary families who took her in and then gave her back, about the loneliness of growing up without roots, without belonging anywhere. Richard, in turn, spoke about Helen, about the love they had, about the plans they made that would never be realized. It was strange at first. Maria had Helen's face, but she was a completely different person. Her experiences had shaped a tougher, more distrustful personality, but also an incredibly resilient one. She had a sharp sense of humor, a direct way of speaking that contrasted with the gentle kindness Helen had always shown. But there was also a deep goodness in her, hidden under layers of protection built over years of suffering. Richard found himself admiring this strength, admiring how Maria had managed to survive so much and still maintain some hope, some ability to dream. She worked hard, was honest, and looked after other vulnerable women who began to work with her at the cart. She had principles, values, dignity, and the more Richard got to know her, the more he realized he was developing feelings that went beyond compassion or obligation. This realization terrified him. He felt guilty, as if he were betraying Helen's memory. How could he feel something like this for another woman, especially his deceased wife's twin sister? It was wrong. It was confusing. It was disturbing. Richard began to pull away to space out his visits, but Maria noticed. She always noticed everything. One day she confronted him. It was a hot afternoon in December, and they were sitting on a bench near the cart drinking coconut water. Maria turned to him and said, without beating around the bush, "You're avoiding me. Why?" Richard hesitated. He didn't know how to explain the whirlwind of feelings consuming him. But Maria deserved honesty. "Because I'm confused," he admitted. "Because when I look at you, I see Helen, but I also see someone completely different, and I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know if what I feel is real or if it's just a projection of what I've lost." Maria was silent for a moment, processing his words. Then she spoke with surprising calmness. "I'm not Helen, I never will be. But I'm not just her shadow either. I'm me, Maria, with my own story, my own life, my own mistakes and successes. And if you can't see me that way, then it's better you stop coming here. Because I don't want to be anyone's consolation or a substitute for someone who's gone." Her words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. She was right. Completely right. He had to decide what he really felt, and he had to be honest with himself. It wasn't fair to Maria. It wasn't fair to Helen's memory, and it wasn't fair to himself to continue in this uncertainty. "I need time," Richard said, "to understand what's happening to me." Maria nodded. "All right. But while you're thinking, I'm going to get on with my life. I've learned I can't wait around for other people's decisions. I have to make my own choices." Richard left that meeting with an even heavier heart. He spent days reflecting, sorting through his emotions, trying to separate grief from genuine feeling. He visited Helen's grave several times, talked to her, as he always did, asked for signs, for forgiveness, for guidance. And during one of those visits, as the sun set over the cemetery, painting everything in orange and gold, Richard finally found clarity. He had loved Helen with every fiber of his being. That love would never disappear, would never be replaced. But Helen was gone and he was still alive. And being alive meant having the right to feel, to connect, to move on. What he felt for Maria was different from what he had felt for Helen, but it was no less real. It was a new feeling built on respect, admiration, and a genuine connection that had grown between two survivors of devastating losses. Richard returned to the Port Authority terminal a few days later. He found Maria working, as always, but she wasn't alone. There were 3 other women with her now, all with difficult histories, all finding at the hot dog cart not just a job, but a place of belonging. Maria was teaching one of them how to prepare the buns with patience and kindness. When she saw Richard, her face lit up for a fraction of a second before she recomposed her neutral expression. "You're back," she said simply. "I'm back," Richard confirmed, "and I know what I feel. It's for you, Maria, not for who you look like, but for who you are, for your strength, your honesty, your ability to turn pain into something beautiful. I'm not looking for Helen in you, I'm seeing you for the first time for real." Maria stopped what she was doing. The other women discreetly moved away, giving them space. She looked at Richard for a long moment, her eyes searching for sincerity, for truth. And then, for the first time since they had met, she smiled. It was a small, careful, but genuine smile. "That's a lot of pressure for someone who only knows how to make hot dogs," she said, trying to ease the tension with humor. Richard laughed, and it was the first time in months he had truly laughed. "The best hot dogs in New York, I'd say." "Flatterer," Maria joked. They started seeing each other more often after that, but always carefully, always respecting their own boundaries and the complicated feelings involved in their relationship. Richard introduced Maria to Julia, and the two developed an immediate connection. Julia saw in Maria someone who understood what it was to survive, and Maria saw in Julia the child she herself had once been. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The city around them was not ready to accept their story. And when rumors began to spread about the wealthy businessman getting involved with a woman identical to his deceased wife, storms began to gather on the horizon. Richard knew challenges were coming, but for the first time since losing Helen, he felt ready to face them. Because now, he wasn't alone. He had Maria. And he had Julia. And together they would find a way to move forward. The news spread like wildfire. Richard didn't know exactly how it happened, but within weeks, the entire social circle he and Helen had frequented was buzzing. The widowed businessman who was involved with a woman identical to his deceased wife. The story had all the elements that fed the worst instincts of gossip: tragedy, mystery, potential scandal. People loved to judge what they didn't understand. It started subtly. Lingering glances when Richard entered a corporate event. Conversations that abruptly ceased when he approached. A drastic decrease in messages on his phone, as if people no longer knew what to say to him. Richard tried to ignore it, to keep his head held high and carry on with his life, but it was difficult. It was as if an invisible shadow followed him wherever he went. The situation exploded when a society columnist for a popular newspaper published an article with the sensationalist headline, "Inconsolable Widower Finds Love in Deceased Wife's Exact Copy." The text was full of innuendo, speculation, and half-truths. It spoke of Richard and Maria as if it were a story of morbid obsession, as if he were trying to replace Helen with a poorer, more convenient version. It didn't mention they were twin sisters. It didn't mention the tragic separation in childhood. It didn't mention anything that could humanize the story or provide context. Richard read the article sitting in his office, his hands trembling with anger and helplessness. How dare they reduce something so complex, so profound, to a cheap scandal to sell newspapers? He thought about suing, about demanding a retraction, but his lawyer advised against it. The more attention they gave it, the worse it would get. It was better to let the storm pass. But the storm didn't pass. It grew. Social media filled with unsolicited opinions. People who had never heard of Richard or Maria suddenly became experts on relationships and grief. There were those who defended Richard, saying he had the right to move on. But the majority were cruel. They called Maria an opportunist, a gold digger, a woman using her appearance to manipulate a vulnerable man. They called Richard disrespectful, a betrayer of Helen's memory, someone who hadn't honored the proper grieving period. The most venomous comments were accompanied by cruel comparisons. Photos of Helen and Maria side by side, highlighting every physical difference resulting from such different lives. "The original was so much prettier," one said. "The cheap knockoff of true love," said another. Each word was a stab, and Richard knew Maria was seeing it all too. He went to her one night, after another exhausting day of dealing with judgmental stares at work. Maria was in her own place now, a small apartment Richard had helped her rent in a safer neighborhood. She was no longer sleeping at the cart as she used to. When Richard rang the bell, she took a while to answer. When she finally opened the door, it was clear she had been crying. "You saw," Richard said. It wasn't a question. Maria nodded and stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was simple but cozy. She had decorated it carefully, placing flowers in a makeshift vase, arranging her few possessions with care. But now, sitting on the old couch Richard had bought at a thrift store, she looked small and vulnerable. "I can't take it anymore, Richard," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been through a lot in my life, hunger, cold, abandonment, loneliness. But this is different, this is cruel in a way I wasn't prepared for. People hate me without even knowing me. They think I'm some kind of monster taking advantage of your pain." Richard sat beside her and took her hand. "I know. And I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to go through this." "It's not your fault," Maria said, but there was bitterness in her voice. "Or maybe it is. Maybe we should have kept our distance. Maybe this was a mistake from the beginning." "It wasn't a mistake," Richard said firmly. "Maria, look at me. What we feel is real. What we've built together is real. It doesn't matter what other people think or say. They don't live our lives. They don't know what we've been through." "But they have power," Maria replied. "The power to destroy reputations, to make people look at you differently, to isolate you. You have a business, Richard. You have responsibilities, and I'm becoming a burden to you." "You have never been and will never be a burden," Richard said, squeezing her hand. "If anything, you saved me. You gave me a reason to keep going when I thought I had lost everything." Maria looked at him, her eyes full of unshed tears. "And Helen? What would she think of all this?" The question echoed in the silence of the apartment. Richard thought for a long moment before answering. Helen loved me, and she would have loved you too if she'd had the chance to meet you. She was generous, kind, always wanted to build a big family full of love. If she were here, I'm sure she would be happy to know I found you, that I found her sister, and that I'm not alone anymore. Maria finally let the tears fall. Richard held her and they stayed like that, for a long time, finding comfort in each other amidst the chaos that surrounded them. But the worst was yet to come. A few days later, Richard received a call from Arthur Anderson, Helen's adoptive father. The man's voice was harsh, filled with restrained anger. We need to talk. In person. Today. Richard agreed, and they arranged to meet at an elegant restaurant in Midtown. When Richard arrived, Arthur was already there, sitting at a table in the back, accompanied by his wife, Beatrice. They had always been kind to Richard during his marriage to Helen, but now their faces were closed, hostile. Richard, Arthur greeted without standing to shake his hand. Arthur, Beatrice, Richard replied, sitting down. You wanted to see me. We want you to stop, Beatrice said, getting straight to the point. Her voice trembled with emotion. Stop this madness. Stop tarnishing our daughter's memory. Richard felt anger rise, but he controlled himself. I'm not tarnishing anyone's memory, and Maria was Helen's sister. You know that. We don't know anything, Arthur interrupted. This woman could be anyone. She could be using you, manipulating you with this twin sister story. Have you considered that? I have proof, Richard said, keeping his voice firm. The documents, the certificates, everything. Maria is Helen's identical twin, that is a fact. Even if it's true, Beatrice said, her eyes red, it doesn't change the fact that you're disrespecting our daughter. Helen hasn't even been gone a year and you're already with someone else, and on top of that, one who looks exactly like her. It's sick, Richard. Don't you see? What's sick, Richard replied, his patience wearing thin, is that you hid the truth about her origin from Helen. Did you know she had a sister? Did you know her biological mother? Spent years looking for her other child. You stole the chance for Helen to know her own family. The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur and Beatrice exchanged glances, and Richard realized he had struck a nerve. We did what was best for Helen, Arthur said finally. We gave her a life her biological mother never could have. Education, opportunities, love. We protected her from a painful past that would have brought nothing good. It wasn't your decision to make, Richard said. It was hers, and now she's gone without ever having had the chance to make that choice. Beatrice began to cry silently. Arthur placed a hand on hers, but his face remained hard. We will do everything in our power to protect Helen's legacy, he said. If you continue with this woman, we will take legal action. We will challenge any attempt to include her in inheritances or properties. We will use our influence to ensure she doesn't take advantage of you or our daughter's memory. Maria doesn't want anything from you, Richard said, standing up. And neither do I. You can use all the influence you want. It won't change a thing. I will stand by her, regardless of what you do. He left the restaurant without looking back, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and anger. The Andersons' threat was not empty. They had money, connections, expensive lawyers. They could make Richard's life very difficult if they wanted to, but he didn't care anymore. He was tired of living according to others' expectations. Meanwhile, Maria was facing her own demons. The public exposure brought back old traumas, the feeling of not being good enough, of always being the second choice, the one left behind. She started having nightmares about her childhood, about the faces of people who rejected her, about the loneliness of the cold orphanage dormitories. Some nights she would wake up in a panic, drenched in a cold sweat, her heart racing. Richard tried to be there for her, but he had his own battles. His business partner started pressuring him to step away from management for a while, arguing that the scandal was affecting business. Important clients were reconsidering contracts, concerned about the image that would be associated with the company. Richard refused to yield, but the pressure was constant. It was Julia, surprisingly, who brought a moment of clarity amidst the chaos. One afternoon, when Richard went to visit her at the group home, she was sitting in the garden reading a book. When she saw him, she closed the book and looked at him with that serious gaze that was so characteristic of her. "Why do you care so much what other people think?" she asked, without beating around the bush. Richard sat beside her on the grass. "It's not that simple, Julia. People can make your life very difficult when they don't approve of your choices." "But are you doing something wrong?" she insisted. "Are you hurting anyone? Are you stealing? Are you lying?" "No." "Then why care?" Julia picked up her book again. "When I lived on the street, people judged me all the time. They said I was dirty, that I was lazy, that I should be in school. But they didn't know I had no choice. They didn't know my story. And if I spent my life caring about what they thought, I never would have survived." Richard looked at the girl and felt a wave of admiration. How could someone so young, who had been through so much, have so much wisdom? "You're right," he said, smiling. "Thank you, Julia." "You're welcome," she replied, returning to her book. "Now go tell Maria that. She needs to hear it too." Richard spent the rest of that day thinking about Julia's words. That evening, he went to Maria's apartment. She opened the door with eyes red from crying but tried to smile when she saw him. "Hi," she said, her voice tired. "Hi," Richard replied. "Can I come in?" They sat on the couch, and Richard told her about his conversation with Julia. Maria listened in silence, and when he finished, she said, "That girl is wiser than both of us put together." "It's true," Richard agreed, "and she's right. We can't let other people's opinions control our lives. We have to live according to what we believe is right." "But what if we're wrong?" Maria asked, vulnerable. "What if this really is disrespectful to Helen's memory? What if we're being selfish?" Richard took her hands in his. "Maria, I loved Helen with every part of me, and that love will never end. But she's gone, and I'm here, and you're here. And what we feel for each other is real, it's honest, it's built on respect and genuine care. There's nothing wrong with that. Helen would have understood. She would have wanted me to be happy, and she would have loved to know you." Maria finally let the barriers she had built come down. She threw herself into Richard's arms and cried, not from sadness but from relief. Relief to finally have someone who saw her for who she really was, not as a shadow or a substitute, but as Maria, complete, complex, imperfect, but valuable. That night they made a decision. They would no longer hide. They would no longer live in fear of others' judgment. They would face the world with their heads held high together. If people couldn't understand, that was their problem, not theirs. But making that decision was one thing. Living with the consequences would be another entirely. And Richard and Maria were about to discover that the world is not always ready to accept stories that challenge its norms and expectations. The storms to come would be even more intense than anything they had faced before. The following months were an emotional roller coaster. Maria decided she would no longer hide, and this decision manifested in practical and powerful ways. She transformed her hot dog cart into something more than just a business. It became a landmark for vulnerable women who needed an opportunity, a fresh start, someone to believe in them when no one else did. The Port Authority terminal witnessed the birth of a small movement. Maria hired 3 more women, all with difficult pasts. There was Sandra, who had fled an abusive relationship and was living in hiding with 2 small children. There was Constance, a 50-year-old woman who had lost everything after the company she worked at for 20 years went bankrupt. And there was Renata, a young, single mother trying to balance night school with the need to support a baby. Together, they created more than a food cart. They created a support network, a space where they could talk about their pain without judgment, where they could dream again, where they learned from each other how to survive and thrive. Maria taught recipes, shared profits fairly, helped with practical matters like documentation and access to social services. She became not just an employer, but a community leader. The initiative's success did not go unnoticed. A local newspaper ran a positive story about Maria's work, highlighting how she was changing lives. The report drew attention, and more women began to seek her out. Some wanted to work, others just sought guidance or a friendly ear. Maria attended to them all with the same patience and generosity, remembering when she herself had no one to turn to. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The cart's growth bothered other vendors at the terminal. There was a group of men who had dominated the informal trade in that area for years, charging unofficial fees, controlling the best spots and intimidating anyone who dared to challenge their authority. They didn't like seeing a woman, especially one generating so much positive buzz, occupying a space they considered their territory. They started with subtle intimidation. Posters Maria put up advertising specials were torn down during the night. Customers were approached by these men with false stories about the quality of the food. Suppliers began to receive veiled threats not to sell ingredients to her. Maria realized what was happening, but refused to give in. She had fought her whole life. She wasn't going to give up now. One night, as she was closing the cart later than usual, 3 men approached. The leader, a burly man with scars on his face, spoke in a threatening tone. "You're drawing too much attention, lady. This ain't no place for someone who wants to be a star. Either you start cooperating with us, paying your share, or things are going to get difficult." Maria looked at him without fear. Years of surviving on the streets had taught her how to read people, to identify when someone was truly dangerous and when they were just a bully. These men were dangerous, but Maria also knew that showing weakness would be worse. "I'm not paying you anything," she said firmly. "I work honestly, I pay my taxes, I have a legal permit to be here. If you have a problem with me, you'll have to take it up with the authorities." The man laughed, a humorless laugh. "Authorities? We're the authority here, you'll see." They left, but the threat lingered in the air. Maria didn't tell Richard anything immediately. She didn't want to worry him further, didn't want to seem weak or dependent. But Sandra, who witnessed the scene, insisted she seek help. Reluctantly, Maria eventually told Richard a few days later. His reaction was immediate. He wanted to involve the police, hire security, make a scene. But Maria stopped him. "That will only make things worse. These men will see any outside interference as a challenge. I need to handle this my way, Richard. Trust me." Richard didn't like it, but he respected her request. Maria, in turn, reached out to other female vendors at the terminal, forming a silent alliance. Together, they were stronger. They began to support each other, to document the intimidation, to create a network of witnesses. Slowly, the power of the intimidators began to wane. Meanwhile, something inside Maria began to stir. The revelations about Helen, about the twins' separation, about the biological mother who had died searching for her. All of it had opened a wound she didn't know existed. Maria began to think constantly about Rose, her mother. Who was she? What did her voice sound like? Did she have the same eyes? The same hands? Maria had no memory of her, no photo, no record other than cold, bureaucratic documents. One night she shared these thoughts with Richard. They were sitting in her small apartment, a candle lit on the table casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I wish I knew more about her," Maria said, her voice soft. "About Rose. Who she really was beyond the reports you brought. There must be someone who remembers her, someone who can tell me something." Richard held her hand. "We can try to find out. We'll go back to the investigator, we'll look for people who might have known her. If there's any clue, we'll find it." And so another journey began. Richard contacted the investigator again, but this time with a different goal. They weren't just looking for documents, but for living stories, memories, people who had crossed paths with Rose Smith. It was a difficult search. Rose had lived on the margins of society, in places where people come and go without leaving a trace. But the investigator was good at his job. After weeks of research, he found a lead. A woman named Mrs. Lucia, who had worked at one of the shelters where Rose had stayed in her final years. Mrs. Lucia was now in her 70s, retired, and lived in a simple house in Queens. When Richard and Maria reached her, the woman received them with surprise, but also with a natural kindness. "Rose Smith, Mrs. Lucia repeated the name, her eyes filling with tears. "My goodness, it's been so long, but I remember her, yes, how could I forget?" They sat in the small but tidy living room. Mrs. Lucia served coffee and cookies and began to talk. Rose was such a beautiful young woman, despite everything she'd been through. She had these big, sad eyes, but when she smiled, she lit up the whole room. She came to the shelter where I worked, a bit lost, talking about a daughter she had left somewhere and needed to find. No one took her very seriously. You know how it is. A lot of people who go through hard times end up making up stories. But Rose was different. She wasn't making anything up. It was all true. Maria listened to every word with rapt attention, absorbing each detail as if she were assembling a puzzle of her own identity. She stayed with us for about 6 months, Mrs. Lucia continued. She worked when she could, cleaning houses, doing laundry. She saved every penny she could to pay for a lawyer to help her find her daughter. She would show these old papers, certificates, saying the girl must have been about 12, 13 at the time. But the system is complicated, you know. Records get lost, children are transferred. Rose knocked on so many doors, but she never found her. And what happened to her? Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Lucia sighed deeply. She got sick. An infection that wasn't treated properly because she didn't have money for private doctors, and the public hospitals were always overcrowded. By the time she finally got care, it was too advanced. She didn't have the strength to fight anymore. I was there when she passed. It was at the public hospital in a crowded hallway with no family, just me holding her hand. Tears streamed down Maria's face as she tried to contain them. Richard put his arm around her shoulders, offering silent support. Before she passed, Mrs. Lucia said, also crying now, she asked me for one thing. She asked that if I ever found her daughter, to tell her that she never stopped looking, that she loved that little girl every single day, even without knowing where she was, that she was so sorry she couldn't take care of both of them. Those were her last words. Maria covered her face with her hands and wept as she hadn't since childhood. She wept for the mother she never knew, for the woman who spent her last years in a desperate and unsuccessful search. She wept for the injustice of a system that separated a poor family without offering a way to reunite them. She wept for all that could have been, and never was. Mrs. Lucia got up and went to an old cabinet. She returned with a shoebox tied with string. After Rose passed, I kept the few belongings she had. I didn't know what to do with them, so I just kept them. I always thought that one day someone might come looking. I guess that day has come. She handed the box to Maria. With trembling hands, Maria opened it. Inside were a few old, worn clothes, a simple rosary, and a small faded photograph. In the photo, a young Rose was smiling, holding 2 babies in her arms, the twins, Maria and Helen, just a few months old. She carried that photo everywhere, Mrs. Lucia said. She said it was proof that her girls existed, that she wasn't crazy. Maria held the photo as if it were the most precious object in the world. There was her mother, young and full of hope before life broke her. There they were, the 2 sisters cruelly separated by fate. For the first time, Maria had a tangible connection to her past, proof that she had been loved, even if she had never felt that love. "Thank you," she managed to say, looking at Mrs. Lucia. "Thank you for taking care of her, for being there at the end, for keeping these things. You have no idea how much this means to me." Mrs. Lucia smiled through her tears. "She would have been so happy to know you're okay, that you survived, that you built a life." When they left Mrs. Lucia's house, Maria clutched the box to her chest as if it were a priceless treasure. Richard drove in silence, respecting her moment. Only when they arrived back at the apartment did Maria finally speak. "My mother looked for me. She never gave up on me." "Never," Richard confirmed. "And she would be so proud of the woman you've become." That night, Maria placed the photo of Rose in a simple frame and positioned it next to the photo of Helen that Richard had given her weeks before. 2 women she had never known in life, but who were now part of her story, her identity. She looked at the 2 photos for a long time, feeling something heal inside her. It wasn't the end of the pain, but it was the beginning of acceptance. The following days brought a new Maria, more confident, more rooted, more aware of who she was and where she came from. She began to speak openly about her story to the women who worked with her, sharing her sorrows but also her victories. This created a greater intimacy, a sense of community that strengthened them all. But the outside world remained hostile. The Andersons did not give up their attempts to interfere. They hired lawyers to question the legitimacy of Richard and Maria's relationship, trying to prove she was manipulating him. Private investigators began to follow Maria, looking for anything that could be used against her. It was a terrible invasion of privacy, but Maria had a clear conscience. There was nothing in her past or present that could be twisted into anything truly damning. Julia continued to be a constant and stabilizing presence. She visited Maria regularly, helped at the cart on weekends, and brought a young, refreshing perspective to everything. One Saturday, while helping to prepare hot dogs, Julia asked a direct question. "Are you guys going to get married?" Maria almost dropped the bun she was holding. "What? Julia, where did you get that idea?" "It's kind of obvious," Julia said, shrugging. "You like each other. You're together all the time. You take care of each other. Isn't that what people who love each other do?" Maria looked at Richard, who had stopped what he was doing and was also looking at her. There was a moment of silence charged with meaning. "It's complicated," Maria said finally. "People wouldn't take it well." "People haven't taken anything well so far," Julia replied with relentless logic. "And you've stayed together anyway. So why let them decide what you can or can't do?" Richard smiled. That girl had a special talent for getting straight to the point. "She's right, you know," he said to Maria. "I know," Maria replied. "But I'm scared, Richard. Scared that this is too fast, too intense. Scared that we're being impulsive because of everything that's happened." Richard moved closer and took her hands, ignoring the hot dog bun residue sticking to his fingers. "Maria, nothing we've been through has been impulsive. It's been hard, it's been painful, but every step has been deliberate. I choose you every day. Not because you look like Helen, but because you are you. Because your strength inspires me. Because your kindness heals me. Because when I'm with you, I feel like I can face anything." Maria felt tears well up again, but this time they were tears of happiness. "I choose you too," she whispered. Julia clapped, breaking the romantic moment with her characteristic practicality. "Great! So when's the wedding? Can I be the maid of honor?" They laughed, and in that moment, surrounded by the smell of grilling hot dogs and the noise of the terminal, they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that despite all the obstacles, despite all the judgment, they could build something beautiful together. But the peace was always temporary. The following week, a new wave of attacks on social media emerged. This time they were more coordinated, more vicious. Someone was clearly paying to spread fake news, creating fake profiles that accused Maria of terrible things. They said she had a criminal record, used drugs, had stolen money from Richard. None of it was true, but the mud was being slung with such force that some of it inevitably stuck. Richard hired lawyers specializing in digital defamation to combat the accusations and trace the source of the attacks. It was no surprise when they discovered the money was coming from an account linked to the Anderson family. They had gone too far, and now there was enough evidence to sue them. When Richard confronted Arthur with the evidence, the man finally broke. "I just wanted to protect my daughter's memory," he shouted with tears in his eyes. "Helen was everything to me and Beatrice, and you replaced her in less than a year with a version of her you found on the street." "I didn't replace anyone," Richard shouted back. "And Maria is not a version of Helen. She is the twin sister Helen never knew because of you. You hid the truth from her whole life." "We protected her," Arthur insisted, "from suffering, from poverty, from pain." "You deprived her," Richard retorted. "You deprived her of knowing her roots, her real family. And now Maria is paying the price for your decisions, being attacked and slandered by people who don't even know her." The confrontation ended with threats of lawsuits from both sides, but also with something unexpected. Beatrice, who had watched everything in silence, finally spoke. "Enough," she said, her voice firm. "Enough, Arthur. He's right. We were wrong. We hid the truth from Helen because we thought it was for the best, but it was our decision, not hers. And now we're making the same mistake, trying to control a situation that doesn't belong to us." Arthur looked at his wife in disbelief. "Beatrice, you can't be serious." "I am. I'm tired, Arthur, tired of fighting the inevitable. Helen is gone, and as much as it hurts, life goes on. Richard has the right to move on, and Maria has the right to exist without being attacked for a crime she didn't commit." It was a turning point. Arthur fell silent, defeated, while Beatrice stood up and addressed Richard. "I can't say I completely approve of your relationship with Maria. It's too confusing, too painful for me. But I will stop fighting it. I will ask Arthur to do the same. And I will withdraw the lawyers and stop the attacks." Richard nodded, surprised but grateful. "Thank you." When Richard told Maria everything, she could hardly believe it. "It's over? For real?" "Not completely," Richard admitted. "There will still be people who judge, who talk. But at least the active war is over." Maria hugged Richard tightly, feeling a huge weight lift from her shoulders. Maybe, finally, they could breathe. Maybe they could start building something without constantly having to defend themselves. Maybe they could just live. The months that followed brought a relative calm, but also a growing restlessness. With the end of the open war against the Anderson family, Richard and Maria could finally breathe without feeling constantly under attack. The hot dog cart thrived. Julia was adapting well to school and showing an impressive talent for math, and the relationship between Richard and Maria deepened with each passing day. But there was something in the air, a sense that this peace was fragile, temporary, built on foundations that could crack at any moment. People around them kept staring. The silent judgments persisted. When Richard and Maria appeared together in public, whispers followed them. They were no longer direct attacks, but the subtle disapproval was palpable. It was like living in a city where everyone knows your story, where every step is watched, every decision analyzed, every moment of happiness questioned. It was exhausting. One night, after a particularly tense dinner at a restaurant where they felt the stares of other patrons throughout the meal, Richard and Maria returned to her apartment in silence. They sat on the couch side by side and remained that way for long minutes without saying a word. It was Maria who broke the silence. "I don't know if I can go on like this," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's not fear, it's not shame. It's just that I'm tired, Richard. Tired of feeling like we're always justifying ourselves, always explaining, always fighting for people to accept something that should be simple." Richard held her hand. "I know. I feel the same way." "Have you ever thought about leaving?" Maria asked, turning to face him. "Leaving New York? Starting over somewhere else, where nobody knows us, where we're not the city's story?" Richard looked into her eyes and saw not just weariness, but also hope. The hope that there was a place where they could simply be themselves, without carrying the weight of others' expectations. "I have," he admitted. "More than you know. But it's a big decision. We have responsibilities here. The company, the cart, Julia. You can manage the company from anywhere in the world," Maria said. "You've said that yourself many times. And as for the cart, I can leave it in the girls' hands. Sandra is already practically managing everything on her own. She's more than capable. And Julia—" Maria paused, thinking. "Julia deserves to have a normal life too. A life where she isn't the street kid who was saved by the rich man, where she can just be a girl, growing up, studying, dreaming." Richard was silent, processing her words. The idea of starting over somewhere else was both terrifying and liberating. He had deep roots in New York. He was born there, built his life there, loved Helen there. But those same roots now seemed to be suffocating him, tying him to a past he couldn't change and to judgments he couldn't control. "Where would we go?" he asked, still hesitant. "I don't know," Maria replied, and for the first time in that conversation she smiled. "But I think that's part of the adventure, isn't it? Choosing a place where we can truly start over, a place where we can build something of our own, our way." In the following weeks, the idea began to take shape. Richard did research, talked to his business partner about the possibility of managing the company's operations remotely, and explored options in countries that offered opportunities for entrepreneurs. Maria, for her part, began preparing Sandra to take over the cart's management completely. She explained all the processes, introduced suppliers, and taught her how to handle the finances. Sandra was scared at first, but Maria had confidence in her. "You can do it," Maria said, holding Sandra's hands. "You're strong, smart, and you have the heart of a lioness. These girls will be in good hands with you." Sandra cried, hugged Maria, and promised she would honor the trust placed in her. As for Julia, when they told her about the possibility of moving, the girl reacted with her characteristic seriousness. She asked practical questions about school, about the language if they moved to another country, about what life would be like there. But deep in her eyes, Richard and Maria saw something that rarely appeared: genuine excitement. The chance to start over completely was something Julia, with her history of abandonment, understood deeply, perhaps better than either of them. "I'm going with you," she said simply. "You're my family now. I'll go wherever you go." The final decision came on a Sunday morning. Richard woke up early and went to Greenwood Cemetery, something he hadn't done in a few weeks. He knelt before Helen's headstone and began to speak as he always did. "Helen, I need to tell you something. I'm leaving. I'm leaving New York, starting a new life somewhere else with Maria, with Julia. And I know it might seem like I'm running away or abandoning you in some way, but that's not it. I will never abandon you. You will always be here." He touched his chest over his heart. "But I can't keep living trapped in the past. I can't keep letting what others think control my life. You would have taught me that. I know you would. You were always brave, always free. And now I need to be too." He stayed there for a few more minutes in silence, feeling the gentle morning breeze on his face. And then something strange happened. A deep peace washed over him, as if a part of him that had been trapped was finally set free. He felt, in a way he couldn't rationally explain, that Helen approved, that she wanted him to be happy, that she understood. Richard stood up, touched the headstone one last time and whispered, "Thank you, my love, for everything. I'm going to make you proud." Their chosen destination ended up being England. It was an English-speaking country which would make Julia's adaptation to school easier. It had an attractive program for foreign entrepreneurs, and it offered a quality of life that would allow them all to start over without completely losing their cultural connection to the US. Besides, London was a beautiful, welcoming city, large enough to offer opportunities but small enough not to feel lost. The next few months were a whirlwind of preparations: visas, documentation, selling property, organizing furniture and belongings. Richard decided to sell his New York apartment and keep only a few investments he could manage remotely. Maria threw a big farewell party at the cart, gathering all the women she had helped over the months, celebrating what they had built together. There were tears, hugs, and promises to keep in touch. Sandra officially took over the cart, and under her management, it continued to grow and help even more women. The seed Maria had planted would continue to flourish even without her. Julia, despite her excitement, had her moments of fear. One night, a few days before the trip, she sought out Maria. "What if I don't fit in?" she asked, vulnerable. "What if the kids there don't like me? What if I can't learn the British accent?" Maria sat with her and hugged her. "Julia, you survived the streets of New York. You faced hunger, cold, danger, and came out stronger. There is nothing in London you can't overcome. And besides, you won't be alone. We'll be together, always. Promise?" "I promise." On the eve of their departure, Richard organized one last get-together. He invited the few true friends he had kept through all the turmoil, and surprisingly, Beatrice Anderson also showed up. She brought an old wooden box. "This belonged to Helen," she said, handing the box to Richard. "It's some family jewelry. Letters she wrote when she was younger, photos. I thought you'd like to take it. And maybe, if you ever want to, you can share these memories with Maria. After all, she is Helen's sister. She deserves to know the sister she never had the chance to meet." Richard was deeply moved. He thanked Beatrice, and in that moment he felt a cycle finally close. The day of departure dawned overcast, but without rain. At JFK Airport, a small crowd gathered to say goodbye. Sandra and the other women from the cart were there. Mrs. Lucia also managed to come, some of Richard's work colleagues, and even Beatrice appeared once more. The farewells were emotional. Long hugs, abundant tears, promises of future visits. Julia hugged each person with an intensity that revealed how much the moment meant to her. She was leaving behind the only city she had ever known, but she was gaining a family that had chosen to stay with her. When they finally passed through security and headed to the gate, the three of them walked together, Richard in the middle, Maria on one side, Julia on the other. While waiting for their flight to be called, Maria took the photo Mrs. Lucia had given her from her pocket, the photo of Rose with the two babies. She looked at it for a long moment and then said, "I thought I would take this photo with me, but I've changed my mind. I'm going to leave it with Mrs. Lucia. She took care of my mother at the end. She deserves to have it. And besides, I don't need to carry the past with me everywhere anymore. I have you guys. I have the present. I have the future." Richard smiled and kissed her forehead. "You're amazing, you know that?" "I know," Maria joked, and the three of them laughed. The flight to London took about 7 hours. Julia slept most of the way, but Richard and Maria stayed awake, talking softly, making plans, dreaming of what was to come. When the plane began its descent, and they saw the city of London stretching out below them, bathed in the golden light of dawn, they felt an emotion impossible to describe. The first few months in London were about adapting. They rented a small but charming house in Notting Hill, with windows overlooking a quiet garden square. Julia was enrolled in a local school, and despite initial difficulties with the accent and some different expressions, quickly made friends. Her talent for math caught the attention of her teachers, and she was encouraged to participate in student competitions. Richard found local partners interested in his business ideas and began developing projects that combined technology and sustainability. Working in a new environment, without the weight of old expectations, renewed his creativity and enthusiasm. Maria, for her part, decided she no longer wanted to work with food. She wanted something different, something that reflected this new phase of her life. She ended up finding her calling in social work. She began volunteering with organizations that helped immigrants and refugees adapt to life in the UK, using her own experience of overcoming adversity to inspire and guide others. But their true family business turned out to be a small bookstore cafe they opened together on a quiet street in Notting Hill. Richard handled the administrative side, Maria managed the day-to-day and created cultural events, and Julia, on weekends, helped by serving customers and organizing the shelves. It was modest, but it was theirs, built with their own hands, with love and dedication. The bookstore quickly became a meeting point for the local community. They held poetry readings, live music nights, and discussion groups on various topics. They met incredible people, made true friends, and created bonds that were not based on who they were in the past, but on who they chose to be in the present. 6 months after their move, on a particularly beautiful evening, with a starry sky and the distant sound of a pub's music nearby, Richard proposed to Maria. It wasn't anything grand or extravagant. They were at home after a simple dinner they had, prepared together, when Richard knelt down and said, "Maria Smith, you transformed my pain into joy, my past into a future. You showed me that it's possible to start over without forgetting, that it's possible to love again without betraying those we loved before. You are my companion, my partner, my family, and I want to spend the rest of my life by your side. Will you marry me?" Maria cried, smiled, and said yes. Julia, who had watched everything from her bedroom doorway, appeared, applauding and shouting that she wanted to be the real maid of honor now. The wedding took place a few months later, in a simple and intimate ceremony at a small registry office in London. Only truly important people were present, a few friends they had made in England, Mrs. Lucia, who managed to travel to be there, Sandra, who came representing all the women from the cart, and Beatrice, who surprisingly accepted the invitation and attended with a simple but significant gift, a letter Helen had written years ago about what she hoped for in true love. The letter ended by saying she hoped Richard would always be happy, no matter what happened. During the ceremony, Richard and Maria included a special moment. They lit 2 candles, one in memory of Helen, the other in memory of Rose. 2 women who never met in life, but who were essential for that moment to exist. 2 women who, in different ways, taught them about love, sacrifice, and hope. Julia was the maid of honor, as promised. She read a short text she had written herself about the meaning of family, about how family is not just about who shares your blood, but who shares your life, your choices, and your heart. There wasn't a dry eye in the room when she finished. After the wedding, life followed its natural course. Julia grew up, became a brilliant and socially engaged teenager. She won a scholarship to study engineering at a top university and continued to live with Richard and Maria. The bookstore cafe prospered and opened a second location. Richard sold his share in his original company in the US and invested all his time and resources into social projects that truly mattered to him. Maria found peace in simply being who she was. No longer the poor woman, no longer the shadow of a dead sister, no longer the controversial lover of the wealthy widower, just Maria, a woman who loved, was loved, and lived with purpose and dignity. Years passed. One day, on a quiet spring morning, Richard woke up before everyone else. He went out to the small balcony of their house and looked out at the city that was now his home. London was waking up slowly, the soft sounds of life beginning another day. He thought about everything he had lived through, all the losses and gains, all the storms and calms. Inside the house, hanging on the living room wall, were two small frames. In one, the photo of Helen, smiling eternally on that day in the park. In the other, the photo of Rose, which Mrs. Lucia had eventually returned to Maria years later, saying that she needed that memory more than anyone. Two women, two stories, two destinies that had intersected through the impossible. Richard went back inside and found Maria already awake, making coffee in the kitchen. She smiled when she saw him, that smile he never tired of seeing, and he hugged her from behind, kissing her neck. "Good morning, my love." "Good morning," she replied, turning, to kiss him properly. Julia appeared shortly after, already dressed for university, talking animatedly about a research project she was developing. They had coffee together, talked, laughed, made plans for the day. It was a morning like so many others, simple, ordinary, but filled with a love that had been forged through suffering and overcoming. Before leaving, Richard stopped in front of Helen's picture. He looked at her photo and whispered, "Thank you for having existed, for loving me, for teaching me that true love doesn't bind but liberates. You are always with me, but now I know it's okay, that I made the right choice, that I honored you by choosing to live, not to die with you." Maria appeared beside him and took his hand. Together, they looked at the two photos. "They would have loved each other," Maria said softly, "if they had had the chance." "I'm sure of it," Richard agreed. They left the house together, Richard heading to a meeting about a new social project, Maria to a talk she was giving at a school about resilience and new beginnings. Julia had already left for the university. At the door, before they parted, the three of them shared a quick hug. "I love you," Richard said. "I love you too," Maria replied. "You guys are too sappy," Julia joked, but she was smiling. And so they went on, each on their own path, but always connected by invisible yet unbreakable bonds. A family not born of blood or traditional circumstances, but of the deliberate choice to love and support each other and build something beautiful together amidst the wreckage of what life had thrown at them. On a silent morning many years ago, a man devastated by loss had visited his wife's grave. A hungry girl had told him an impossible secret, and from that unlikely encounter, from that unexpected revelation, something was born that no one could have predicted. Not the replacement of one love with another, but the expansion of the heart to accommodate new ways of loving, new ways of living, new ways of being. The deceased wife remained present, not as a shadow or a comparison, but as a bridge between the past and the future. The twin sister found not only the history that had been stolen from her, but also the family she always deserved. And the abandoned girl discovered that belonging doesn't depend on birth, but on choice. 3 lives that could have been consumed by tragedy were instead transformed by the courage to face judgment, the determination to move forward, and the profound understanding that true family is born not of blood, but of choice, and of the courage to move on. End of story. Dear listeners, We hope the story of Richard, Maria, and Julia has touched your heart. If you were moved, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you the most. Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul. We'll see you in the next episode.